For 11 years, he built tables for strangers and never one for himself. His name was Caleb, and he lived alone in a workshop at the edge of town, filling other people's homes with things he'd never let into his own. Then, one Tuesday afternoon, a woman appeared in his doorway with a suitcase and a message from a man who had been dead for 3 months. She wasn't looking for love, and he wasn't looking for anyone, but her father's dying wish left them both with no good reason to say no. By the end of this story, your heart is going to feel very, very full. Caleb's workshop sat at the end of a dirt road just outside of town, so small that most maps forgot it was there. The building was old, its wood aged to the color of dark coffee, with a tin roof that sang in the rain and let in gold when the sky cleared. The air inside carried the smell of cedar and linseed oil. He built tables and chairs and cabinets there for 11 years, each one made by hand, each one meant for someone else's kitchen, someone else's life, and never once had he made a piece for his own home. You know, the kind of loneliness that doesn't announce itself. It isn't dramatic or loud or the thing that makes you call someone at 2 in the morning because the quiet has become too heavy to carry. It settles the way dust settles on a shelf. You keep meaning to clean quietly and without asking, until one day you realize the house hasn't held another voice in years. That was Caleb's version of it. He hadn't chosen the loneliness, but he had stopped fighting it. And there's a kind of surrender that feels almost like peace if you don't look at it too carefully. His wife had been gone for 6 years. He didn't say her name out loud anymore. Not because the sound of it still broke something in him, but because there was no one left to say it to, and names need another pair of ears to stay alive. Her blue mug with the chipped handle still sat in the cabinet between two he never used, and her garden grew wild behind the house because he watered it without ever learning the names of what she planted. The flowers came back every year in colors he couldn't identify, and he let them, because pulling them up would have felt like making a choice he wasn't ready to make. The house stayed the way she left it, not as a shrine, but as a pattern he couldn't break. The second chair at the kitchen table remained pulled out, though he knew she would never sit in it again, and he ate standing up most nights because sitting across from an empty seat made the room feel too large and too still at the same time. The workshop was where he really lived. The house was just the place he went when the light gave out. He drove into town on Saturdays for supplies, and the people at the hardware store knew him by name but not by story. They'd ask how he was, and he'd say fine, and they'd nod, and that was enough for everyone involved. Nobody in a small town wants to be the one to push past a wall that clearly wasn't built to be pushed. But nobody came to his door either, and he didn't go to theirs. And the distance between those two things had grown so wide over the years that he couldn't have crossed it even if he'd wanted to. And the thing about a life built around absence is that it holds together perfectly fine until someone comes along and knocks on the door. Caleb didn't know that yet. He thought the shape of his days was fixed and permanent, the way a chair believes the room around it is the entire world. He was about to learn how wrong a quiet man can be about the one thing he feels most certain of. There was a man who came before the silence, and his name was the first one Caleb reached for when his hands didn't know what to do. The mentor had been older, patient in the way that only people who have made every mistake there is can be, and he had taught Caleb how to build furniture, and even more, how to listen to the wood before you cut it. He would stand behind Caleb at the bench and adjust his grip on a chisel the way a father adjusts a child's hand on a pencil, and he'd say, "Let the wood tell you where it wants to go." Caleb had been 23 when they met, raw and grieving and angry at the world, and the old man had seen something in him that Caleb couldn't see in himself. They worked side by side for almost 9 years. The mentor had a shop across town, smaller than Caleb's but warmer, filled with pieces he'd built over 4 decades and never sold because they were for the people he loved. He showed Caleb how to read the grain, how to feel for knots hidden inside a board, how to sand a surface until it felt like water under your hand. But the thing Caleb remembered most wasn't the technique. It was the way the old man listened when Caleb talked about his wife, how he never offered advice or tried to fix anything, just sat there and held the silence, the way you hold a door open for someone who needs to walk through at their own pace. The mentor died 11 months before Charlotte arrived. Cancer fast and quiet, the kind that doesn't give you time to prepare even when it tells you it's coming. Caleb found out from a phone call on a Thursday morning, and he set down his tools and sat in the workshop for 3 hours without moving because the man who had taught him how to build things was gone, and there was nothing left to build with that knowledge. He went to the funeral and stood in the back and didn't speak to anyone, and he drove home with the windows down, even though it was cold, because the silence in the truck was worse than the wind. The mentor had a daughter. Caleb knew this the way you know a detail someone mentions twice in 9 years, present but peripheral, a person who existed in stories but never in the room. The old man talked about her sometimes, the way parents do, with a warmth that softened his voice and a distance that said she was far away, living her own life in a city somewhere, visiting on holidays, calling on Sundays. Caleb had met her once, maybe twice, at the shop, and he remembered brown hair and a quiet smile and the way the mentor's whole face changed when she walked in. But she was a background detail in a life already full of grief, and he hadn't thought about her in years. He didn't know that the mentor had been thinking about him. He didn't know that the old man had been watching him pull away from the world for years, worrying about it the way only someone who has seen you at your worst can worry. In the last months of his life, the mentor had made a decision that would change everything, and he hadn't told Caleb about it because the dead don't tell you their plans. They leave them behind in the people they trust to carry them out. It was a Tuesday in late October when the gravel crunched under tires, and Caleb looked up from the bench with his hands still resting on a half-finished chair. Nobody came up that road. The delivery truck came on Thursdays, and the mail carrier left things at the box at the end of the drive, and anyone else who found their way to his door was either lost or selling something he didn't want. He wiped his hands on his apron and stood there listening. The way you listen when a sound enters a space that has been quiet long enough to make you forget what sound is. The engine cut, a car door closed, and then footsteps on the gravel, steady and unhurried, coming toward the workshop like the person walking them had nowhere else to be. Caleb moved to the door and opened it before the knock came, partly because he wasn't expecting anyone, and partly because something in the sound of those steps felt deliberate, like they had been aimed at this specific door from a very long way away. She stood on the porch in the fading afternoon light, and the first thing he noticed was that she looked like her father. The same shape of face, the same steady eyes, the same way of standing that said she had been taught patience before she was taught to speak. Her brown hair was pulled back, and she held a single suitcase in one hand, and her jacket was too thin for October, and she looked like someone who had been traveling for a while and had finally run out of places to go. "You're Caleb," she said, and it wasn't a question. She said it the way you say the name of a place you've been hearing about your whole life when you finally see it with your own eyes. He nodded because he knew who she was, or he knew enough. The mentor's daughter. Charlotte. The name came back to him from some old conversation, and he realized as he stood there that he was looking at the one person in the world who could show up at his door, unannounced, and make him open it instead of close it. "I need to talk to you about my father," she said, and her voice was steady, but her hand on the suitcase handle wasn't. "Can I come in?" And there it was. The door was already open, and he could have said no. And part of him wanted to, because a closed door is the easiest thing in the world to maintain once you've learned how to keep it shut. But she said her father's name, and that name was a key that fit every lock Caleb had ever built, and he stepped aside because the man who taught him everything had earned the right to send his daughter through his door. Even she stepped inside, and the suitcase touched the wooden floor with a soft sound that seemed too small for the weight it carried. The workshop held them both in its lamplight, two strangers sharing the ghost of a man who had meant something different to each of them. Caleb pulled out the stool by the bench, the only other seat in the room, and she sat down, and for a moment neither of them spoke, because the silence between them wasn't empty. It was full of everything they hadn't said yet. Charlotte set the suitcase between her feet and looked at Caleb across the short distance of the workshop floor, and what she said next was something he would turn over in his mind for weeks. "My father died 11 months ago," she said, "and before he died, he told me to find you." Caleb didn't say anything. He leaned against the bench and waited, because the mentor had taught him that too, that sometimes the most important thing you can do with your hands is keep them still. Charlotte took a breath and went on, her voice staying level even as the words got heavier. "He said you were a good man who had stopped letting anyone take care of you, and that I was a woman who had stopped letting anyone care about me, and that we might be able to help each other with that if we were willing to try." She told him about her mother, who died when Charlotte was 16, and about the years that followed. She moved from city to city, building a career that kept her moving, and a life that never stayed still long enough to grow roots. She told him about coming back for her father's last months, sitting beside his bed, holding his hand. He told her things he had never told her before about the people he loved and the worries he carried and the future he wouldn't get to see. And then she said the thing that changed everything. "I don't have anyone left," she said, simply, without self-pity. "The way you state a fact you've lived with long enough to stop being surprised by it. And you don't either. My father saw that in both of us, and he believed that two people who understood loss the way we do could build something together that neither of us could build alone." She wasn't asking for romance. She wasn't asking for love or promises or the kind of future people plan together when they're young and certain. She was asking for a place to belong, a roof and a table and someone to come home to. She was offering the same thing in return, a reason to come inside before dark and a reason to let the house hold more than one person's silence. "I'm not asking you to love me," she said, and the directness of it was so unexpected that Caleb felt something shift in his chest, not pain, but something older and quieter, like a door that had been sealed shut for years, giving way a quarter of an inch. "I'm asking you to let me stay, and I'm asking you to let me try to make this place feel like it's lived in again, because I need that as much as you do." The cedar smell hung in the warm air between them. Caleb stood very still. The words she had just spoken were describing his own wound from the inside, and he had spent 6 years pretending that wound didn't exist. Here was a stranger standing in his workshop, naming it out loud like she had been reading the same book he had, just from a different chapter. Caleb didn't answer right away. He turned back to the bench and picked up a piece of sandpaper and put it down again because his hands needed something to do and nothing felt right, and the silence in the workshop had changed shape. It wasn't the comfortable silence he was used to. It was the kind that comes right before a decision you know you can't take back. He thought about his wife. Not the way he usually thought about her in fragments and small details, but fully the way you think about someone when you're trying to decide what they would want for you. She had been gone 6 years, and in that time he had built his grief into a wall so high and so complete that he couldn't see over it anymore. He wondered what she would think about a stranger standing in his workshop, asking to stay, carrying a promise from a dead man like a key to a door he had forgotten he had, and he thought she would have said yes. She believed that closed doors were a waste of good hinges, and she would have seen what the mentor saw, that Caleb was a man drowning in stillness and calling it peace. The thought of her saying yes made something in him ache, not with fresh grief, but with the old, familiar kind, the kind that comes when you realize the person you lost would have understood something about you that you still can't understand about yourself. He looked at Charlotte sitting on the stool, her hands folded in her lap, waiting with a patience that reminded him so much of her father that it almost undid him. She wasn't pushing. She wasn't pleading. She was just there, present and steady, and he recognized something in her that he knew from the inside out, that particular exhaustion of being alone and telling yourself you're fine, until the lie gets so comfortable you stop noticing. He thought about the mentor, about the last time they had sat together in the old man's shop, about the way the mentor had looked at him across the bench with an expression that Caleb had mistaken for tiredness, but that he now understood was something else entirely. The old man had been trying to say something. He had been trying to tell Caleb that the door was still there, under all the walls, and that someone would come along who knew how to find it. Caleb hadn't heard him because he had been too busy sanding a table for someone else's home. The fear was real. It sat in his chest like a stone. The fear of opening something he had spent years sealing shut. The fear that letting one person in meant admitting he had needed someone all along. But the fear of another 10 years, the same silence, the same empty chair, the same nameless flowers growing wild behind a house that had forgotten how to hold a voice that was worse than the risk of letting someone in. Charlotte's words had named it, and naming a thing is the first step toward being brave enough to face it. "All right," Caleb said, and it was 2 words with no speech and no conditions and no promises about what it would become. He was just a man agreeing to something his hands already knew was right. The way you know a joint is flush before you measure it. The wood tells you, and you learn to trust the wood. They figured out the shape of it in the quietest way possible. The guest room at the end of the hall had a bed and a dresser and a window that looked out over the garden, and that was where she would sleep. She would cook if he would let her, and he would keep working, and they would figure out the rest the way you figure out anything, one day at a time. With more patience than plan, Charlotte picked up the suitcase and carried it inside. The small physical act of it, the wheels crossing from gravel to wood, felt enormous to both of them, though neither one said so out loud. That first night she cooked in his kitchen. It was nothing complicated, just pasta and a simple sauce and bread she found in the freezer. But the smell of it filled the room in a way it hadn't been filled in years, and Caleb stood in the doorway watching her move through the space like she had been studying it from the inside for a long time. She knew where the pots were without asking. She opened the cabinet and reached past the blue mug with the chipped handle without touching it, without commenting on it, and set a pot on the stove. And something about the way she did that, how she acknowledged the mug by not acknowledging it, told Caleb she understood more about this house than he had expected. They ate at the table. He sat down for the first time in months, pulling the chair in, and she sat across from him in the seat that had been empty for 6 years. The silence between them was different now, not empty, but new. The way a room feels when you rearrange the furniture, the same pieces in a different order. She asked if the sauce was all right, and he said it was good. She smiled, a small smile that didn't try to be anything more than it was. The food was warm, and the kitchen was warm, and the house felt, for the first time in a very long time, like it was holding something other than memory. Caleb cleared the plates and she dried, and they stood side by side at the sink with the water running, and neither of them wanted the sound to stop. It was the loudest thing the house had heard in years. The arrangement was built on presence, not conversation. That first night taught them both something they needed to learn. Sometimes the most powerful thing two broken people can do for each other is simply be in the same room and let the silence start to feel like company instead of absence. The rhythm of shared space came slowly, the way water finds its way into cracks, not by force, but by patience and the quiet certainty that it belongs there. Charlotte moved through the house in the first weeks with a carefulness that respected the years of silence already living in it, never pushing, never rearranging, just settling into the spaces Caleb had left empty without knowing he had left them empty for. She left a book on the kitchen table one morning, a novel with a worn cover, and it sat there all day until Caleb moved it to the counter. The next morning, another one appeared in the same spot. He realized she wasn't forgetting. She was leaving small pieces of herself in the rooms the way you leave a coat on a hook, a quiet way of saying, I'm here and I'm staying, and this space is starting to know me too. She fixed the screen door that had been sticking for months. She brought home flowers from the market. Flowers she could name, and put them in a jar on the windowsill where the morning light hit first. Caleb noticed they were the same colors as the ones growing wild behind the house, the ones his wife had planted, though Charlotte couldn't have known that. The coincidence sat in his chest like a warm stone, and he didn't mention it, because some things are more powerful when they go unsaid. If you've ever lived alone long enough to forget the sound of someone else moving through the house in the morning, you know how strange and how good it is to hear it again. They found their routines without discussing them. Coffee together in the kitchen before he went to the workshop, the pot between them on the table, the morning light coming through the window and catching the steam. Dinner at the table most nights, sometimes simple, sometimes something she had spent the afternoon on, and walks in the evening when the weather held, down the dirt road and back, their footsteps falling into a rhythm that neither of them planned, but both of them noticed. The awkwardness of those first days faded, not into comfort exactly, but into something softer than strangers and quieter than friends, a space that didn't have a name yet, but was starting to feel like it deserved one. And Caleb caught himself watching her, not often and never for long, but in the small, unguarded moments when she didn't know he was looking. The way she read by the window in the morning with her coffee getting cold, how she laughed when the radio played a song she recognized, the small gesture of tucking her hair behind her ear when she was thinking hard about something. He noticed these things the way you notice the grain of a piece of wood without meaning to, because your eyes have learned to see what's in front of them, even when your mind is somewhere else. Each time he caught himself, he looked away fast. He was unsettled by the fact that he had noticed, and more unsettled that noticing felt less like an intrusion and more like something his heart had been waiting to do. The thing that changed everything was a mug. It happened on a morning about 3 weeks in, no different from any other morning, except for what Charlotte did with her hands. Caleb came in from the workshop for coffee and found her standing at the counter, and she turned and set a cup in front of him at the table and he looked down and felt the air leave his lungs because it was the blue mug with the chipped handle, the one that had sat in the cabinet untouched for 6 years, the one he couldn't bring himself to use and couldn't bring himself to put away. She had washed it and filled it with coffee and placed it in front of him as if it were just a cup, because to her it was just a cup. That was the thing that broke him open. She hadn't erased his wife, or moved the mug, or replaced it, or asked about it. She had simply acknowledged that it existed and that it was meant to hold coffee, and she had filled it, and the warmth of it under his palms was so unexpected and so gentle that Caleb felt something crack in his chest that he had been holding together with nothing but stubbornness for 6 years. He told her about the mug, not the whole story, but enough. It had been his wife's, and he had kept it in the cabinet because using it felt like moving on, and putting it away felt like letting go. Both had felt impossible for so long that the mug had just stayed where it was, frozen in the space between holding on and releasing. Charlotte listened the way her father had listened, with her full attention and no advice, and Caleb realized, as he talked, that she had the same gift the old man had, the ability to hold someone's pain without trying to fix it, to sit with it the way you sit with a fire, close enough to feel the warmth, but not so close that you try to control the flames. That was the moment the arrangement stopped being an arrangement. Neither of them said it out loud because saying it would have changed it, and it wasn't ready to be changed yet. But the air in the house shifted, the way weather shifts before a storm, except this was the opposite of a storm. It was the feeling of something opening, something that had been sealed for so long that the seal had become invisible, and now the seal was broken, and the house breathed differently, and so did the people in it. The mug sat between them on the table, empty now, and Caleb looked at it and for the first time in 6 years saw it as what it was. It wasn't a relic or a monument to grief, just a cup that someone he loved had used and that someone he was learning to care about had filled. That was enough. That was more than enough, and it was the beginning of something neither of them had a name for. Yet, after the mug, everything moved closer. Not fast, not the way it happens in the stories where one grand gesture rewrites the whole script, but gradually, the way dawn comes, 1 degree of light at a time, until you look up and realize the dark is gone and you can't remember exactly when it left. Caleb started leaving the workshop door open while he worked, and it was a small thing. A door held ajar, but it was a door he had kept closed for years. And the difference between closed and open was the difference between a room that holds one person. Charlotte drifted in some afternoons and sat on the stool by the window with a book or a cup of tea, and she didn't talk while he worked, and he didn't need her to, but the sound of her turning pages and the warmth of another body in the room changed the quality of the silence in a way that made the wood feel different under his hands. One afternoon, he showed her how to sand a piece of walnut, standing behind her and placing his hand over hers on the sanding block, showing her the angle, the pressure, the way you follow the grain instead of fighting it. The contact of her skin against his was quiet and electric at the same time. The kind of touch that doesn't ask for anything, but doesn't pretend it doesn't mean anything either. She looked up at him, and he looked away, but not as fast as before, and the slowness of that looking away was its own kind of progress. She told him about her father's last months, about sitting beside his bed in the room where she had grown up, holding his hand while it got thinner, listening to him talk about the people he loved, as if he were making a list of things he wanted to leave behind in the right hands. She cried, not loudly, not the kind of crying that asks for comfort, just the kind that comes when you finally let yourself feel something you've been carrying in a closed fist for too long. Caleb didn't look away. He reached across the space between them and put his hand on hers, and she held it, and the workshop held them both, and neither of them let go for a long time. And Caleb started saying things he hadn't said in years. Small truths, the kind that don't feel like much until you realize how long they've been sitting inside you with nowhere to go. He told her about the nights when the silence was so loud he couldn't sleep, and the mornings when he stood in the kitchen and forgot why he was there. Grief turns into habit, he said, and habit turns into the shape of your life until you can't tell what you're choosing from what you're just surviving. They were no longer strangers sharing a roof. They were two people learning each other in the dark, finding the edges of each other's wounds, pressing gently against the places that still hurt, and staying there when the flinching stopped. The thing about happiness is that it doesn't announce its own fragility. It feels solid while you're standing in it, and it's only afterward that you understand how thin the ice was beneath your feet the whole time. It started with a visitor, a man from town who stopped by on a Saturday to pick up a bookshelf Caleb had finished. Charlotte was in the kitchen making lunch, and the man came to the door and saw her through the screen and smiled in that small-town way and said to Caleb, "I see you got company. That's good. You must still miss her." Something awful, though. Some things don't get easier. He meant Caleb's wife. He said it the way people say things when they don't know the full picture, casually, with the kind of kindness that doesn't realize it has an edge. And Caleb, standing in his own doorway with Charlotte 10 feet away and listening, said yes. He said it too fast and too firmly, and the word came out sounding like a defense, like a man putting up a wall he had just spent weeks learning to take down. Charlotte heard it. She didn't say anything, and her face didn't change, but something behind her eyes shifted, and Caleb saw it and understood too late what he had done. It wasn't jealousy, it was something worse. She was looking at someone who had been left before and recognized the first step of leaving, even when the person doing it didn't know they were leaving yet. She saw him retreating behind the wall she thought they had broken through together. That night the house went quiet again, but a different kind of quiet, not the warm, lived-in silence they had built together, but the old silence, the cold one, the one that had lived in the walls before Charlotte arrived. She pulled back, not from anger, but from instinct. The oldest instinct she had, the one that said, protect yourself first because no one else is going to do it. The distance between them grew over the next few days the way a crack grows in a piece of wood, slowly at first and then all at once. Caleb felt her pulling away and misread it completely. He thought she had realized the arrangement was a mistake, that she was planning to leave, and the fear of that was so sharp and so familiar that he did what he had always done with fear, which was to meet it halfway by pulling back first, so at least the leaving wouldn't surprise him. They were both doing the same thing at the same time, protecting themselves by stepping away from the one person who had made them feel safe enough to stop protecting. They spent 3 days like that, circling each other in a house that felt bigger and emptier with every hour. Charlotte cooked for one and ate standing up, and Caleb worked late and came in after she had gone to bed. The second chair at the table sat empty again. The mug went back in the cabinet, and the silence was louder than before because now they both knew exactly what they were missing. On the fourth morning, Caleb came in from the workshop and found the suitcase by the front door. It was packed. It was closed. It was sitting exactly where it had been the first day, on the wooden floor waiting to be carried back out into the world, and the sight of it hit him the way the knock had hit him weeks ago, except in reverse, because this time the door was closing instead of opening. Charlotte was in the kitchen standing at the counter with her back to him, and she wasn't crying. She was perfectly still, the way you get still when you have made a decision and are just waiting for your body to agree to carry it out. She heard him come in and didn't turn around, and the silence between them was the heaviest it had ever been, heavier than the first night, heavier than all the quiet days before, because this silence had a shape, and the shape was goodbye. "You don't have to leave," Caleb said, and the words came out wrong, too flat, too much like a man stating a fact instead of a man asking someone to stay. And he knew it even as he said it. Charlotte turned around. Her eyes were dry and steady, and she looked at him the way her father used to look at him, with that expression that saw straight through to the thing you were hiding from yourself. "I'm not leaving because I have to," she said. "I'm leaving because I can't stay in a house where I'm caring more than the other person wants me to." And that was when Caleb understood what he was about to lose. It wasn't an arrangement, or a housemate, or a convenient fix to a lonely life. She was the person who had washed the mug and sat on the stool by the window and turned pages while he worked. The person who had cried in his workshop and let him hold her hand and filled his house with the sound of someone living in it. She had given him back the feeling of being someone who mattered, and he had let it slip through his fingers because he was too afraid to admit that it mattered. He stood in the doorway, and the words came, not smoothly, not the way he had imagined saying them in the moments he had let himself imagine it, but rough and honest and too big for the room. "My father said you needed someone to care for you," Charlotte whispered. And her voice broke on the last word, and Caleb looked at her and said the only true thing he had left. He was right. But then he went further, because the mentor's wish wasn't enough anymore, and a dead man's promise wasn't what was holding him there. "But it isn't about what your father wanted," he said, and his voice was low and unsteady and more alive than it had been in years. "It's about what I want. And I want you here for reasons that have nothing to do with promises or arrangements. You made this house feel like a home again, and I don't want to go back to the way it was before you walked through that door." Charlotte looked at him. The suitcase sat between them on the floor, packed and closed, and the morning light came through the window and caught the dust in the air, and the house held its breath. "Say it again," she said, "without my father's name attached to it." And Caleb looked at her and said it again just for her, and the room went still, and the door he had been locking for years stayed open. Charlotte unpacked the suitcase. She did it slowly, deliberately, each item pulled from the bag and returned to the cabinet, the shelf, the drawer where it belonged, and Caleb watched from the doorway as the evidence of leaving was undone, one piece at a time. Every shirt she hung back in the closet, every book she set on the nightstand, every small object returned to its place, felt like a promise being remade, not in words, but in the quiet language of staying. That night, they didn't sit at the kitchen table. They went to the porch, the way the mentor used to sit with Caleb on summer evenings. 2 chairs facing the yard where the wildflowers grew, and the air was cool and smelled like the last of the October garden. They talked in a way they hadn't before, the way people talk when the walls are already down and there's nothing left to hide behind. Charlotte told Caleb she had been afraid too. It wasn't him or the house she feared, but the fact that she had come because of her father's wish and stayed because of something she couldn't name. Naming it had made it real, and real things can be lost, and she had already lost everything once and wasn't sure she could survive doing it again. She said it plainly, without drama, the way you say something that has been true for a long time and finally has a place to land. Caleb told her he had spent years thinking grief was something you carried alone, that accepting help meant admitting you couldn't hold the weight, and holding the weight was the last thing his wife would have wanted him to hold on to. He had confused surviving with living, and Charlotte had shown him the difference. She hadn't used words or advice or grand gestures. She had filled the mug and fixed the door and sat on the stool, doing all the small ordinary things that add up to a life being lived instead of a life being endured. He told her the last thing the mentor had said to him, something he hadn't told anyone, not because it was a secret, but because he hadn't understood it until now. "You're going to think I taught you how to build furniture," the old man had said from his bed, his voice thin but steady. "But I taught you how to build a home. Don't forget the second one." Charlotte laughed through tears because that sounded exactly like her father, the kind of man who hid life's biggest lessons inside the smallest words. And Caleb laughed too, and it was the first time the house had held laughter in 6 years, and the sound of it traveled through the rooms like something waking up. The truth settled between them, simple and enormous, the way truth does when it finally arrives after a long time coming. They didn't choose each other. The mentor chose for them from the other side of living, with the stubborn hope of a man who believed that two broken people could mend each other. But what grew from that choice, from that borrowed beginning, was entirely their own. It wasn't inherited or arranged or owed to a dead man's wish. It was just two people who had been alone too long, finding out that the door was never locked, only waiting for someone brave enough to knock. Caleb worked with the door open, and Charlotte read on the stool by the window, and the mug sat between them on the bench, warm and full, and the wood shavings caught the afternoon light. Healing isn't the same as forgetting, and the best love stories don't erase the past. They build around it. Tell me in the comments which trope we should visit next, because there's always another story waiting on this porch.